The long-delayed Pragmata is finally here. Built on Capcom's in-house RE engine tech, it sports high-fidelity ray-traced visuals on home consoles and PC, pushing out the state-of-the-art. But it's also making a Switch 2 outing, which presumably requires a very different technical approach. So how does Capcom's latest RE engine effort scale to Nintendo's hybrid? Is this a potent port or a questionable conversion?
This video is brought to you by Digital Foundry and Ludeo. So here's an interesting idea. What if you could check out a game within seconds as a quick sampler, no installation or logins required? With Ludeo, you're able to do exactly that by near instantly playing bite-sized moments from games within your web browser. Just click the start button and away you go. It's all achieved through cloud streaming, where Ludeo's unique SDK is able to integrate with many of the industry's major engines. Think of them as instant demos. Jumping into Robocop Rogue City, for instance, Ludeo pits you against a 2-minute challenge to take down every enemy in sight, all played with a keyboard and mouse within your browser. This sampler of Hitman, World of Assassination also gets a challenge within a time limit, while smaller scale titles like Redacted get a moment in the spotlight. It's all in beta right now, and while there's room for Ludeo to grow, there's clearly loads of potential in the concept. From a player viewpoint, it removes friction between first hearing about a game and going hands-on with it yourself. It's an immediacy of access that plays to the strengths of cloud streaming. And from a developer standpoint, it offers another unique way to engage with players to improve a new game's discoverability to an audience with instantly accessible gameplay. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on Ludeo. So to play these moments right now, check out the links in the description below. And now back to the video.
Pragmata is trimmed down quite a bit to work on Switch 2, but the essential visual character of the game is largely preserved. Let's start by comparing the game to its PS5 counterpart in framerate mode, which represents the mainstream home console experience. Switch 2 takes a number of lighting downgrades. Ambient occlusion seems to be largely or entirely absent on Switch, as models no longer subtly occlude nearby surfaces. Expected duller, flatter image with less lighting variation on surfaces that aren't directly lit. Shadow maps get the usual cutbacks, with a lower resolution and softer appearance, but a lot of objects are excluded from the shadow maps, and some lights no longer appear to be shadow casting. The tables and chairs in this diner are a good example. GI quality also appears to be pared back. Switch 2 has splotchy, dark indirect diffuse lighting, while PS5 seems brighter and less leaky. The PC version, with some of the lower GI settings, sans ray tracing, resembles Switch 2 pretty closely. These concessions make sense for Switch 2, though GI quality in Resident Evil Requiem seemed more closely matched between Nintendo's hybrid and the more power-hungry home platforms. The game's screen space reflections also appear lower quality on Switch 2, with a rougher, low-res look. PS5's framerate mode doesn't enjoy any RT reflection niceties, but its handling of these screen space reflections is still a cut above Switch 2. Asset quality also takes a hit. Curved geometric features, like this astronaut's gloves, are chunkier and less obviously rounded, and textures appear simplified and low-res. These concessions stand out most in cutscenes, because most of the game's interiors have a somewhat featureless quality to them without much high-frequency detail. In larger scale, more artistically inventive areas, you will be able to spot very conspicuously degraded texture art on Switch 2, however. But perhaps the biggest single excision in Pragmata on Switch 2 comes down to hair. Strand-based hair is out, replaced with a more typical card-based approximation. Expect flatter, poorly differentiated hair with a fairly uniform lighting response. Hair moves much more pleasingly with the strand hair as well, resting in a natural splay around Diana's shoulders and rising and falling against the direction of motion due to air resistance. Pragmata is a third-person game, and Diana's long hair is almost perpetually in view, so this downgrade hurts. Image quality on Switch 2, though, compares a bit more favorably than you might think. PS5 seems to make do with a more dated approach to image scaling, relying on a pretty low-quality AA with spatial upscaling up to its output resolution. This mirrors the approach taken by Resident Evil Requiem on base PS5, eschewing the checkerboard rendering solution used previously by many RE engine titles. Internally, the game is operating at about 1080p on PS5 in my counts, though curiously, capture taken by others at DF has produced higher 1440p counts. It's not clear to us exactly what's going on, but we hope to address this issue in future content. Switch 2 seems to rely on DLSS instead, which I suspect is the higher quality CNN DLSS variant. I believe the output resolution is about 1080p here, with an internal res at about 540p. This is a small fraction of the PS5's pixel count, but it manages to output an image that is often cleaner, with more refined geometric and specular detail. Switch 2 does supply softer imagery, but on the whole, it's arguably a competitive picture, which speaks to the much more sophisticated anti-aliasing and upscaling approach on Nintendo's hybrid. Performance isn't quite so rosy on Switch 2, however. In common with most other Capcom titles, the developer has elected to leave Pragmata's frame rate unlocked when it falls below the refresh rate, giving it an unstable feel. In dense exterior sequences, we're often in the 30s and 40s, rarely getting particularly close to 60 FPS. Interiors mostly land in the 50s, holding 60 and more sedate moments. It's just a bad setup for a Switch 2 game, and I would strongly prefer an option to lock the game down, perhaps to a 40 FPS target at 120Hz output or 30 FPS at 60Hz output. It just doesn't feel all that great to play without a more stable update. PS5, in contrast, seems to be a virtually locked 60 FPS in its framerate mode, with no drops whatsoever even in encounters that cause heavy dips on Switch. It offers a much smoother experience. Of course, the framerate mode on PS5 is accompanied by a resolution mode, which despite its name, mostly seems to serve as a toggle for the game's ray tracing. RT reflections give this mode a much more coherent appearance, as so many of the game's environments are replete with glossy artificial planes. The downside here lies in performance. Resolution mode generally hits 60 FPS in the content I sampled, but larger exterior sections and busy encounters can bring frame rates into the 50s and 40s. The PS5 provides a good baseline for current-gen performance in Pragmata, but Microsoft's diminutive Series S is a fair hardware match for Switch 2. It also proves a reasonably close visual match as well, as most of the visual tweaks we observed on Switch 2 carry over to the S. Shadow maps are low quality, GI is simplified, ambient occlusion appears to be absent, screen space reflections are low res, many lights are no longer shadow casting, and the lighting on the whole appears similar. There's even a prominent downgrade. Shadow penumbra appear noisy and dithered on Series S, while Switch 2 sports a cleaner, more homogeneous look. Asset downgrades take their toll on Series S as well. The card-based hair returns here, and the game's models are simplified on Series S too. There's some alignment between Switch 2 and Series S, but we often find that texture details are greatly diminished on Series S relative to Switch 2, like on this Android. I was able to spot one or two instances where Switch 2 might be missing a normal map or something similar, but in most cases any divergences favor Nintendo's hybrid. Image quality on Series S is predictably lacking. It's operating at a low internal resolution of about 720p in my counts, and it struggles to resolve clean, detailed edges. Switch 2 does a much better job of resolving a decent-looking image. I wonder if FSR 2 or 3 might have been a better Series S solution here. AMD's upscalers aren't well suited to running at low resolutions, but I feel like they would have been a better fit regardless. Switch 2 gets its comeuppance in performance, as its wobbly 30 to 60 FPS update contrasts against a solid 60 FPS on Series S. This is a byproduct of reduced rendering grunt on Switch, but its weaknesses could have been eased by a more stable 30 or 40 FPS update, which I would have probably preferred. Switch 2's docked configuration is really only half the story though, so what about Switch 2 in handheld mode? Expect lower resolutions here, as the game runs at about 360p internally with a somewhat soft output, again using DLSS. It's a muddier, more aliasing-prone image, but like other very low-resolution games with DLSS, it holds up better than you would probably expect. Lighting effects that scale based on resolution, like the dithering used for shadows or the resolution of screen space reflections, are affected by that reduced pixel count. Beyond that tweak, handheld and docked play generally look very similar. I wouldn't expect to find any large settings divergences between them. Performance is unstable, with an unlocked frame rate. The frame rate is often in the 30s and 40s here, spiking a bit higher in interior scenes, with overall performance that feels a bit depressed relative to docked play. VRR doesn't appear to be working correctly because the game rarely outputs a stable run of frames, even when it should be within the Switch 2's VRR window. Again, this isn't ideal, and a 30 FPS framerate cap would seem sensible to me. Overall, I have mixed feelings on the Switch 2 version of Pragmata. It's a reasonably impressive effort converting a current-gen console game to run well on mobile silicon. There are a lot of cuts, but none that slice too deeply into the game's basic appearance. Its use of DLSS gives the game an image quality advantage as well, easily clearing the Series S version. On paper, it all seems pretty good, but Capcom's use of an unlocked frame rate is going to make this hard to recommend for players who are sensitive to frame time fluctuations. This issue seems like it might have an easy remedy, but Capcom tends to shy away from explicit framerate caps, even on low-end hardware that can't reasonably hope to match its refresh rate with fresh frames. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at patreon.com/digitalfoundry for exclusive and early access content and to get in touch, use social media.